David Johnson sat in his corner office on the 40th floor, watching the city lights twinkle below like scattered diamonds. The golden invitation card lay on his mahogany desk, its elegant script catching the soft glow of his desk lamp. Riverside High School class of 2004, 20-year reunion. He picked it up again, running his fingers over the embossed letters. 20 years. Had it really been that long? The memories came flooding back like a movie playing in reverse. He could still smell the hallways of Riverside High, that mix of floor wax and teenage anxiety that seemed to cling to every surface. He remembered walking those same hallways, shoulders hunched, always looking down at his worn sneakers that had seen better days 3 years before he got them. David had been one of only 12 black students in a school of nearly 2,000. In the wealthy suburb of Riverside Heights, his family stuck out like a sore thumb. They lived in the small apartment complex on Elm Street, the only affordable housing within the school district boundaries. His mother, Patricia, had worked double shifts at the hospital just to keep them in that tiny 2-bedroom unit. She knew education was the key to a better life for her son. He could still picture her face every morning, tired but determined, as she handed him his lunch money. "You study hard, baby," she'd say, straightening his collar. "Education is something nobody can ever take away from you." She'd drop him off in her 15-year-old Honda Civic, the one with the dented bumper and the engine that sounded like it was clearing its throat every morning. The car was a source of endless embarrassment for teenage David. While his classmates arrived in their parents' luxury SUVs and sports cars, he'd ask his mother to drop him off a block away from school. She never said anything about it, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. Years later, he realized she knew exactly why he made that request, and it must have broken her heart a little each time. Walking into school each day felt like entering enemy territory. David was smart, really smart, and his teachers loved him, but intelligence doesn't protect you from cruel teenagers who see you as different. His clothes came from the discount store and everyone knew it. While other kids wore designer jeans and name-brand sneakers, David made do with whatever his mother could afford. The worst part wasn't even the clothes. It was the way some kids looked at him like he didn't belong there, like he was taking up space that was meant for someone else. The scholarship kid, that's what they called him, though not always to his face. "Hey, scholarship," they'd whisper as he passed. "Don't forget where you came from." But he never could forget. How could he? Every day was a reminder. There was one group in particular that made his life miserable. They were led by Brad Mitchell, whose father owned half the commercial real estate in town. Brad had everything handed to him. The best clothes, the newest gadgets, a BMW for his 16th birthday that cost more than David's family made in a year. But having everything wasn't enough for Brad. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in making sure David knew he had nothing. "Nice shoes." "Johnson," Brad would say loudly in the hallway, making sure everyone could hear. "Are those the same ones you wore yesterday? And the day before that?" His friends would laugh and David would feel his face burn with shame. The worst part was that Brad was right. David had 2 pairs of shoes, his school shoes and his church shoes. That was it. The humiliation went beyond just comments. There was the time Brad and his friends cornered David in the bathroom and dumped chocolate milk all over his only good shirt, the one he saved for presentations and special occasions. David had to spend the rest of the day with brown stains down his front, fielding questions and concerned looks from teachers who didn't understand why he couldn't just go home and change. "It's just a joke, Johnson," Brad had said when the principal questioned them about it. "Can't you take a joke?" But David knew it wasn't a joke. It was cruelty disguised as humor, and there was nothing funny about it. Then there was the time they spread rumors that David's family was on welfare. It wasn't true, but that didn't matter. Once a rumor starts in high school, it takes on a life of its own. Kids who had never even spoken to David suddenly knew his business. They'd make comments about food stamps and government assistance, laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. David's mother worked herself to the bone to avoid exactly that situation. She was proud, maybe too proud, but she was determined to make it on her own. When David told her about the rumors, her jaw tightened. "Let them talk," she said. "Actions speak louder than words, and your actions will speak for themselves someday." The academic success that should have been David's refuge became another target. When he made the honor roll, Brad and his crew would make jokes about charity case students getting special treatment. When he scored the highest grade on the SATs in his class, they claimed it was because of quota systems and lowered standards. Nothing David achieved was ever just because he was smart or worked hard. There was always some other explanation that didn't give him credit. Sports should have been an escape too. David was fast, really fast, and he made the varsity track team as a sophomore. But even there, the comments followed him. Must be natural talent, they'd say, like his success was somehow less meaningful because of his race. He'd run harder, train longer, push himself until his lungs burned and his legs felt like jelly. But the whispers never stopped. The loneliness was the worst part. David had a few friends, other kids who didn't quite fit into the popular crowd, but he always felt like he was on the outside looking in. He'd watch other kids make plans for weekends, talk about parties and gatherings he was never invited to. Not that his mother would have let him go anyway. She was strict about grades and curfews, but it would have been nice to be asked. There were nights when David would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling of his small bedroom and dream about the future. He imagined a life where money wasn't a constant worry, where he could buy his mother a house with a garden she'd always wanted. He pictured himself successful, respected, maybe even wealthy. In those dreams, he wasn't the scholarship kid anymore. He was just David, and that was enough. Now, 20 years later, sitting in his penthouse office, those dreams had become reality in ways his teenage self could never have imagined. The technology company he'd founded had revolutionized online learning, making education accessible to millions of kids who reminded him of his younger self. The IPO had made him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but more importantly, it had given him the resources to make a difference. His assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Johnson, your car is here for the charity dinner." David looked at the invitation one more time. Part of him wanted to throw it away, to leave the past buried where it belonged. But another part of him, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be invisible, was curious. What had become of Brad Mitchell and his crew? Were they still the same people who had made a scared teenager feel like he was worth nothing? He slipped the invitation into his jacket pocket. Maybe it was time to find out. The rental car smelled like vanilla air freshener and false promises. David had specifically requested something ordinary, a silver sedan that wouldn't draw attention in the parking lot of Riverside. "Hi." His assistant had looked at him, strangely, when he turned down the luxury options. "Are you sure, sir? The Mercedes would be more comfortable for the drive." But David knew what he was doing. He wanted to blend in, at least at first. Let people draw their own conclusions about his life before revealing the truth. It felt like putting on an old costume, pretending to be someone he used to be. The drive from the airport to Riverside Heights took him through neighborhoods he hadn't seen in 20 years. Some things had changed. New shopping centers, updated traffic lights, a Starbucks where the old diner used to be. But the bones of the place remained the same. The same tree-lined streets where he used to walk to school. The same park where he'd practice running after school while other kids hung out at the mall. As he drove past his old apartment complex on Elm Street, David felt his chest tighten. The building looked smaller somehow, more worn down than he remembered. The parking lot was still cracked, weeds pushing through the asphalt like nature's quiet rebellion. A group of kids played basketball on the same court where he used to shoot hoops alone, dreaming of a different life. For a moment, he considered stopping. But what would he say? "Hi, I used to live here and now I'm rich." It felt wrong, like he'd be showing off to people who were still fighting the same battles his family had faced. The high school hadn't changed much either. The same brick facade, the same windows that had watched thousands of teenagers grow up and move on. The parking lot was already filling with cars as former classmates arrived for the reunion. David recognized some of the vehicles, expensive SUVs and sports cars that screamed success. Others were modest family cars, the kind driven by people who had normal jobs and normal lives. He parked toward the back of the lot, next to a minivan with soccer ball stickers on the rear window. As he walked toward the building, David adjusted his tie. He'd chosen his outfit carefully, a well-made suit that looked good but not flashy, the kind of thing a middle manager might wear to a wedding. He wanted to see how people would treat him before they knew who he'd become. The gymnasium had been transformed with balloons and streamers in the school colors. Round tables filled the space where David had once run laps in PE class, trying to avoid the dodgeballs that seemed to find him anyway. A DJ played music from their high school years, songs that instantly transported him back to house parties he'd never been invited to. David? David Johnson?
Oh my God!
He turned to see Rebecca Martinez, a girl he'd sat next to in chemistry class. She looked almost exactly the same, just with laugh lines around her eyes and highlighted hair instead of the natural brown he remembered. Rebecca, wow, you look great. And she did. There was something genuine in her smile, something warm that he didn't remember from high school. I can't believe it's been 20 years. What have you been up to? Are you married, kids? The questions came rapid fire, the way they do at reunions when people try to compress 2 decades into a 5-minute conversation. Still single, David said with a laugh. Too busy with work, I guess. What about you? Rebecca launched into stories about her husband, her 3 kids, her job as a nurse practitioner. She was animated and happy, the kind of person who had found contentment in a life well lived rather than a life well paid. David found himself relaxing for the first time since he'd arrived. Do you remember Mr. Patterson's chemistry class? Rebecca asked. You were always helping me with the equations. I probably would have failed without you, David remembered. Rebecca had been kind to him, not popular enough to risk associating with him publicly, but decent enough to treat him like a human being when they worked together. You were pretty good at chemistry yourself, he said. You just needed confidence. Speaking of confidence, Rebecca lowered her voice. I always felt bad about how some people treated you in school. That wasn't right. Before David could respond, he heard a loud, familiar voice cutting through the noise of the reunion. Johnson. David Johnson! Well, I'll be damned. David's stomach dropped. He'd been at the reunion for less than 10 minutes, and already his past was catching up with him. Brad Mitchell approached with the same swagger he'd had in high school, though 20 years had added weight around his middle and thinned the hair on top of his head. He still carried himself like he owned the room, still smiled like everything was a private joke only he understood. Look who decided to show up, Brad said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The famous David Johnson. Still living in the old neighborhood? The question was casual on the surface, but David heard the subtext. Still poor? Still beneath us? Still the same scholarship kid we used to know? I live out west now, David said simply. Out west, huh? California. Must be nice. Brad's tone suggested he thought it was anything but nice. What do you do out there? Still running track? He laughed at his own joke. I work in business. Business, Brad repeated like it was a foreign word. That's pretty vague. What kind of business? David felt the familiar heat rising in his cheeks, the same feeling he'd had 20 years ago when Brad would corner him in the hallway. But he wasn't a scared teenager anymore. He was a grown man who had built something from nothing, who employed hundreds of people, who had more money than Brad could probably imagine. Technology, David said, keeping his voice steady. Oh, technology, Brad said, drawing out the word mockingly. Like computers and stuff? That's interesting. The way he said it made it clear he thought it was anything but interesting. By now, Brad's old crew had gathered around them. There was Kevin Walsh, whose father had owned a chain of car dealerships. Kevin looked exactly like what he was, a guy who had inherited a comfortable life and never had to fight for anything. Next to him stood Tony Ricci, who had played football and peaked in high school. Tony had the soft look of someone who spent too much time at office happy hours and not enough time in the gym. Guys, look who's here, Brad announced. David Johnson. Remember him? The track star. Again, the mocking tone that suggested being good at running was somehow embarrassing. Hey, David, Kevin said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. Good to see you, man. You look good. The pause before good said everything. You look good for someone like you. You look good considering where you came from. You look better than we expected. How's your mom? Tony asked, and something in his tone made David's jaw clench. She still working at the hospital? She retired a few years ago, David said. He didn't mention the house he'd bought her in Florida, the one with the garden she'd always dreamed of, or the fact that she'd never have to worry about money again. That's nice, Brad said. Retirement's great when you can afford it. Not everyone's that lucky, right, guys? The group chuckled like Brad had said something clever. David looked around the room and noticed that their conversation was attracting attention. Some classmates were watching curiously, probably wondering if the dynamics from high school were about to play out again. Others seemed uncomfortable, like they could sense the underlying tension but weren't sure what to do about it. Rebecca had drifted away, probably sensing trouble. David didn't blame her. In high school, associating with him during one of Brad's performances could make you a target too. So David, Brad continued, clearly enjoying himself, tell us about this technology business. Sounds fancy. You must be doing pretty well for yourself. But the way he said it suggested he thought exactly the opposite. It's going okay, David said. Just okay? Kevin jumped in. Come on, don't be modest. I bet you're living the dream out in California. Probably got a nice apartment, maybe even a house. They were fishing, trying to figure out exactly how far he'd come so they'd know how much to mock him. David realized that in their minds any success he'd achieved was probably modest at best. They couldn't imagine that the scholarship kid they'd tormented had actually made something of himself. I'm doing fine, David repeated. Fine, Brad echoed. Well, fine is good. Fine is better than a lot of people do, right? At least you're not back in the old neighborhood living with your mom or something. He laughed and his crew laughed with him. David felt 20 years of anger and hurt crystallizing in his chest. These men, because that's what they were now, men in their late 30s with mortgages and marriages and responsibilities, were still acting like teenage bullies. They still thought his success or failure was their entertainment, but something else was happening too. As David looked around the room, he saw former classmates who were watching the interaction with obvious discomfort. People who had grown up, who had learned empathy and kindness in the years since high school. Not everyone was still stuck in the past, and David realized something else. He didn't need their approval anymore. He didn't need them to recognize his success or validate his worth. He'd spent 20 years proving to himself that he was more than the scared kid they'd tried to break. The question now was, what was he going to do about it? The evening was supposed to be about reminiscing, catching up with old friends and maybe sharing a laugh about teenage haircuts and fashion choices. Instead, David found himself transported back to the worst moments of his adolescence. Except now he was wearing a $1,000 suit and had more money than everyone in the room combined. Brad seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. He'd always been the type of person who felt bigger by making others feel smaller, and apparently 2 decades hadn't changed that about him. You know what I was just thinking about? Brad announced to his growing audience. Remember that old Honda your mom used to drive, David? That thing was a piece of work. I used to wonder if it would make it up the hill to school every morning. The comment hit exactly where Brad intended. David's mother had been so proud of that car even when it was falling apart. She'd saved for months to buy it, working overtime shifts just to have reliable transportation to get her son to the good school district. My mom loved that car, David said quietly, but his voice carried despite the music and chatter around them. I bet she did, Brad laughed. It was character building, right? Nothing wrong with driving an old car. Builds character. He said it like character was something poor people needed more of, something that came from having less instead of being born into more. Kevin joined in, emboldened by the growing crowd. Remember how you used to have her drop you off a block away? I always thought that was funny. Like we wouldn't figure out it was your mom anyway. The shame from that memory burned fresh even after all these years. David had asked his mother to drop him off away from school because he was embarrassed. He was a teenage boy who just wanted to fit in, and that beat-up Honda felt like a neon sign announcing his family's financial struggles to everyone who saw it. But now, as an adult, he realized the real shame wasn't in the car. It was in being embarrassed of a woman who had sacrificed everything to give her son opportunities she'd never had. She was a good mom, David said, and there was steel in his voice that made a few people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Oh, I'm sure she was, Brad said quickly, realizing he might have crossed a line. I'm just saying we all remember that car. It was memorable. By now, Brad's wife Ashley had joined the group. She was exactly what David expected. Blonde highlights, designer dress, the kind of jewelry that screamed, "My husband makes good money." She looked David up and down with barely concealed disdain. So you're the famous David Johnson, she said, her voice sweet as artificial sweetener. Brad's told me so many stories about high school. David could only imagine what kinds of stories Brad had shared about him. I hope they were good ones, David said politely. Ashley laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, they were something all right. Brad was just telling me about your humble beginnings. It's so inspiring when people overcome their circumstances. The condescension was breathtaking. She was talking about his childhood poverty like it was a disease he'd recovered from, something unfortunate that had happened to him rather than the reality his family had lived every day. Some people never do overcome them. Though, Kevin's wife Jennifer added helpfully, it's sad really. You see people from high school who are still living exactly the same life they were living 20 years ago. The implication was clear. They assumed David was one of those people. They looked at his simple rental car, his modest suit, his refusal to brag about his success and concluded that he was still the poor kid from Elm Street. Well, David says he's doing fine, Brad said, making fine sound like failure. He's got a job in technology out in California. Computers and such. How nice, Ashley cooed. Technology is such an important field these days. Even regular jobs pay pretty well, don't they? Regular jobs. She was categorizing his life's work as a regular job, something ordinary and unremarkable. If she only knew that his regular job had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country, that his technology had changed how millions of kids learned, that he employed more people than her husband's entire company. What kind of technology? Jennifer pressed. Like, do you work for one of those big companies? Microsoft or Google or something? Something like that, David said, not wanting to elaborate. That's so cool, Tony said, but his tone suggested it wasn't cool at all. I bet you get to work with computers all day. Very technical. The way he said technical made it sound like something boring and beneath him, something for people who couldn't succeed in the real world of sales and networking and glad-handing. Do you have your own place out there? Ashley asked with fake concern. I know California real estate is so expensive. I hope you're not stuck renting forever. Again, the assumption. Of course he was renting. Of course he couldn't afford to buy. Of course his life was smaller and less successful than theirs. David thought about his penthouse in San Francisco, the beach house in Malibu, the mountain retreat in Colorado. He thought about the fact that he could probably buy their entire neighborhood without missing the money. I have a place, he said simply. That's wonderful, Ashley gushed. Renting isn't throwing money away like people say, especially when you're single. No point in buying a big house when it's just you, right? More assumptions. Single because no woman would want him. Renting because he couldn't afford to buy. Small place because he couldn't afford anything bigger. The crowd around them had grown. Some people seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but others were clearly enjoying the show. It was like a car accident. Horrible to watch, but impossible to look away from. I remember your clothes in high school, Jennifer said suddenly, as if the thought had just occurred to her. You always dressed so practically. Very sensible. Practically. Sensible. Code words for cheap and secondhand, and clearly marking him as different from everyone else. My mom did her best, David said, and he was proud that his voice remained steady. Oh, of course she did, Ashley jumped in. Single mothers work so hard. It must have been difficult for her trying to keep up with all the other families in the district. There it was. The acknowledgement that they'd all known he didn't belong, that his family had been pretending to be something they weren't just to get him into a good school. She wasn't trying to keep up with anyone, David said, and now his voice had an edge to it. She was trying to give her son an education. And look how well it worked out, Brad said with a grin. You got your education, got a good job. The American dream right there. He made it sound like a participation trophy, like David had achieved the bare minimum expected of someone who'd been given a chance. Some people need more help than others, Kevin added philosophically. Nothing wrong with that. We all start from different places. The paternalism was suffocating. They were talking about him like he was a charity case who had done reasonably well for himself, given his disadvantages. Like his success was impressive only when measured against their low expectations. David looked around the room and caught sight of Rebecca across the dance floor. She was talking to their old chemistry teacher, Mrs. Patterson, and both women kept glancing in his direction with concerned expressions. Even from across the room, they could see that something ugly was happening. You know what I remember most about high school? Ashley said, clearly warming to her theme. How everyone found their level. Like, the popular kids stayed popular. The smart kids became doctors and lawyers. The athletic kids became coaches or went into business. Everyone sort of ended up where you'd expect. She was saying that David had ended up exactly where someone like him belonged. Employed but not successful. Housed but not wealthy, surviving but not thriving. Of course, some people surprise you, Brad added with false magnanimity, like David here. I bet nobody expected him to end up working in technology in California. That's pretty impressive for someone like him. With his background, given where he started, the backhanded compliments were almost worse than outright insults. At least insults were honest. This performance of kindness while simultaneously putting him in his place was masterful in its cruelty. David felt the old familiar rage building in his chest, the same helpless anger he'd felt as a teenager, when these same people had made him feel like nothing. The difference was that now he wasn't helpless. Now he had options. He could walk away. That would be the mature thing to do. He could tell them exactly who he was and watch their faces change. That would be satisfying, or he could do something else entirely. As David stood there, surrounded by people who were still trying to make him feel small 20 years later, he made his decision. But it wasn't the decision anyone, including himself, expected him to make. The moment that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, David's old chemistry teacher, had been watching the interaction from across the room with growing concern. She was in her 70s now, retired for nearly a decade, but she still had the sharp eyes that had made her legendary among students. She could spot trouble from 50 feet away, and she'd seen enough to know that her former student was being cornered by the same bullies who had made his life miserable 20 years ago. She made her way through the crowd with the determination of someone who had spent 4 decades managing teenagers and wasn't about to be intimidated by middle-aged versions of the same problems. David Johnson, she said warmly, inserting herself directly into the circle. I was hoping you'd be here tonight. Mrs. Patterson, David said, and his face lit up with genuine pleasure. It's so good to see you. The pleasure is all mine, she said, giving Brad and his crew a look that could have frozen water. I was just telling my husband about you last week. We saw that article in Educational Weekly about your foundation. Quite impressive work you're doing. The circle went quiet. Educational Weekly wasn't exactly light reading for most people at a high school reunion. What kind of foundation? Rebecca asked. She drifted back into the conversation, drawn by Mrs. Patterson's arrival and the sudden shift in energy. The Johnson Foundation for Educational Excellence, Mrs. Patterson said proudly. They've revolutionized online learning for underserved communities. Quite remarkable, really. Brad's smile faltered slightly. That's nice, he said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. More than nice, Mrs. Patterson continued. Last year alone, they provided free educational technology to over 2 million students nationwide. The impact has been extraordinary. David felt uncomfortable with the attention, but he could see the wheels turning in Brad's head. 2 million students. That suggested resources far beyond what a regular technology worker would have. David's always been modest about his achievements, Mrs. Patterson said, patting his arm affectionately. Even in high school, he never bragged about his academic awards or his perfect SAT scores. Perfect? Jennifer asked, her voice slightly higher than normal. Oh yes, Mrs. Patterson said cheerfully. First student in Riverside High history to achieve a perfect 1600. The guidance counselors were beside themselves. Harvard, Stanford, MIT, they all wanted him. The crowd was definitely paying attention now. Perfect SAT scores weren't common, and they certainly didn't fit with the narrative Brad had been weaving about David's ordinary life. Where did you end up going to college, David? Kevin asked, and for the first time, his voice held genuine curiosity instead of condescension. MIT, David said quietly. MIT, Brad repeated, like he was testing the words. That's a good school. One of the best, Mrs. Patterson said firmly, especially for someone interested in computer science and engineering. Though I understand David double majored in business as well. Double major at MIT. The implications were settling over the group like morning fog, changing the landscape of everything they thought they knew. What year did you graduate? Ashley asked, and her voice had lost its saccharine sweetness. 2008, David replied. Tony frowned. Wait, 2008? That was right when all those tech companies were starting to take off. Good timing. Timing had nothing to do with it, Mrs. Patterson said crisply. David earned every opportunity he got. I remember his senior project, a prototype for educational software that would adapt to individual learning styles. Even then, you could see he was going to change the world. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone was doing the math, trying to reconcile the image of David as a struggling, regular employee with the reality of someone who had graduated from MIT with a double major and had been working on revolutionary educational technology since high school. It was Rebecca who broke the silence. "David, what's the name of your company?" David hesitated. Once he answered that question, there would be no going back to anonymity. But looking around at the faces of people who had spent the evening trying to make him feel small, he realized he was tired of hiding. "Edutech Solutions," he said simply. The name meant nothing to most of them, but Kevin's face went pale. "Wait," he said slowly. "Edutech Solutions? Didn't they have an IPO a few years ago? Made all the financial news?" 2019, David confirmed. Kevin pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. Within seconds, he was staring at a Forbes article with David's picture prominently displayed. 30 under 30, he read aloud in a voice barely above a whisper. "Youngest CEO to take an education technology company public." "Let me see that," Brad said, reaching for the phone. But Kevin had gone pale and wasn't moving. Ashley snatched the phone instead. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the shock on her face as she read. Net worth estimated at— "Oh my God, what?" Brad demanded. "What does it say?" But Ashley seemed incapable of speech. She handed the phone to her husband with shaking hands. Brad read in silence, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been fear. This can't be right. What does it say?" Tony pressed. "It says," Brad's voice cracked. "It says his company revolutionized online education. It says he sold it for $12 billion. The number hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. 12 billion. Not million, billion. Mrs. Patterson smiled serenely. And that was just the first company. The foundation work is even more impressive, in my opinion. David's always been driven by a desire to help students who remind him of himself. More phones were coming out now. People were searching, reading, confirming what seemed impossible. The scholarship kid they'd all dismissed had become one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation. "There's more," someone called out from the edge of the crowd. "He's got real estate holdings, investment portfolios. Look at this list of properties. The penthouse in San Francisco, the beach house in Malibu, the mountain retreat, the ranch in Montana, the brownstone in New York. Each property worth more than most people made in a lifetime. And look at this," Rebecca said, reading from her own phone. "He bought his mother a house in Florida. Says here he credits her sacrifices for all his success. The Honda, the apartment on Elm Street, the double shifts at the hospital." Suddenly, all the things they'd mocked seemed different. Not signs of failure, but evidence of a family that had fought for every opportunity, that had valued education over material possessions, that had sacrificed everything for their son's future. "There's a whole section about his philanthropy," someone else called out. "Scholarship programs for underprivileged students, low-income housing development, educational initiatives in inner cities." Brad stood frozen, still holding Kevin's phone, staring at David's picture on the Forbes website. The same face, but older, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Brad made in a month. "David," Ashley said, and her voice was small now, uncertain. We didn't know." "Know what?" David asked gently. That you had—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Successful?" David supplied. "Wealthy? Important?" The words weren't harsh, but they cut deep. Because they all knew what he was really asking. Would it have mattered? Would they have treated him differently if they'd known? And if so, what did that say about them? The crowd around them had grown massive. Word was spreading through the reunion like wildfire. David Johnson, the quiet kid from Elm Street, the scholarship student they'd all dismissed, was worth billions of dollars. He was famous. He was successful beyond anyone's wildest imagination, and he'd been standing there for an hour, letting them mock his mother's car and his second-hand clothes and his ordinary job, never once defending himself or setting the record straight. "Why didn't you say anything?" Brad asked, his voice hollow. David looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the reunion continued, but their little corner had gone completely quiet. "Would it have changed anything?" David asked. "Would you have treated me differently if you'd known how much money I had?" Brad opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, because they both knew the truth. Of course he would have treated David differently. They all would have. But that was exactly the point. I wanted to see who you all were now, David continued quietly. I wanted to know if you'd grown up, if you'd learned something about treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. I wanted to know if the bullies from high school had become better men. The silence stretched on, heavy with implications. Around them, former classmates were whispering, pointing, trying to process this information. Some looked ashamed. Others seemed excited to suddenly be in the presence of genuine celebrity. But in their little circle, no one seemed to know what to say. Finally, Mrs. Patterson broke the tension. Well, she said brightly, I think this calls for a toast. To David Johnson, who proves that success isn't about where you start, but about where you choose to go. As she raised her plastic cup of punch, David realized that the evening had taken a turn no one could have predicted. The question now was what would happen next. The gymnasium had transformed from a nostalgic gathering into something resembling a press conference. Word of David's true identity had spread through the reunion like wildfire, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to the billionaire who had been hiding in plain sight all evening. But David wasn't interested in the sudden attention from people who had ignored him an hour earlier. He was watching Brad, who stood frozen with the phone still in his hand, staring at an article about David's latest business acquisition. 12 billion, Brad whispered again, as if saying it multiple times would make it make sense. Ashley had gone completely silent, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. The woman who had spent the evening making subtle digs about David's regular job and modest lifestyle was now realizing she'd been talking down to someone who could buy her husband's business without thinking about it. David, she finally managed. I'm sorry. We didn't realize. Realize what? David asked, and his tone was gentle but pointed. That I deserved basic respect regardless of how much money I made? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Because that's exactly what this was about. Not his wealth, but the fact that they had treated him poorly, based on assumptions about his worth as a human being. Kevin was frantically scrolling through more articles on his phone. Listen to this, he said, his voice shaky. Johnson's charitable foundation has donated over $500 million to educational initiatives nationwide, focusing on providing opportunities to students from low-income families. He looked up at David with something approaching awe. $500 million. It's important work, David said simply. Important? Tony laughed, but it was a nervous sound. Dude, you've probably helped more kids than our entire town combined. Why didn't you say anything? David looked around the circle of faces, some ashamed, some confused, all of them struggling to reconcile the person they'd been talking down to with the reality of who he actually was. Because, David said quietly, I wanted to see if you'd changed. I wanted to know if the people who made my life miserable in high school had learned to treat others with dignity. The words were soft, but they hit like punches. Everyone in the circle had been complicit in what happened earlier. Some had actively participated in the mockery. Others had simply stood by and watched, but none of them had defended him. Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching the interaction with the shrewd eyes of someone who had managed teenagers for 4 decades, stepped forward. You know, she said conversationally, I've been teaching for over 40 years and I've learned something interesting. The students who peak in high school rarely end up being the most successful adults, but the ones who struggle, who get knocked down and get back up, who learn resilience and empathy through hardship, they're the ones who change the world. She looked directly at Brad as she spoke. Success in high school is often about social dynamics and family wealth. Success in life is about character and determination, and the ability to treat others with kindness regardless of their circumstances. Brad's face was red now, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. David could see him struggling with competing impulses, the desire to apologize warring with the instinct to justify his behavior. Look, David, Brad finally said, if we said some things that came across wrong tonight, I apologize. It was just friendly reminiscing about old times. Friendly. Rebecca had rejoined the group and overheard the comment. Brad, you spent the entire evening making fun of his mother's car and assuming he was a failure. How is that friendly? More former classmates were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. Some had heard about David's success and wanted to congratulate him. Others were simply curious about the drama unfolding in the middle of the reunion. "I think," David said, raising his voice slightly to address the growing crowd, "that this is a good moment for all of us to remember something important." The gymnasium quieted as people strained to hear. "Success isn't just about money," David continued. "It's about how we treat each other, especially people who can't do anything for us in return. Tonight, some people showed me exactly who they are when they think someone is beneath them, and others showed me the kindness and decency that makes real success possible." He looked directly at Rebecca, at Mrs. Patterson, at a few other classmates who had treated him with basic human dignity. "The money is nice," David said with a slight smile, "but what I'm really proud of is that we've helped millions of kids get educations they wouldn't have had otherwise. Kids who remind me of myself at their age, smart, determined but lacking opportunities." He paused, letting that sink in. "Some of you tonight assumed I was still the poor kid from Elm Street and you treated me accordingly. Others saw a former classmate and treated me with respect. The difference says everything about your character and nothing about my bank account." Ashley was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. "David, please. I'm so sorry. I don't know what got into me. I'm not usually like that." But David suspected she was exactly like that. This was who she became when she thought she was talking to someone she could look down on. "The thing is," David said gently, "I'm still the same person I was an hour ago. The only thing that changed was your perception of my worth. And that's the problem." Brad finally seemed to find his voice. "Okay, look, maybe we came on a little strong tonight. But you have to understand, you were being pretty secretive about your life. How were we supposed to know you were this successful?" "You weren't supposed to know," David said. "That's the point. You were supposed to treat me with basic respect because I'm a human being, not because of how much money I have." The crowd had grown significantly now. Former classmates were pulling up articles about David on their phones, sharing the information with newcomers. The mood was shifting from shock to something approaching celebration, as people began to realize they had genuine celebrity in their midst. But David wasn't interested in being celebrated by people who had been ready to mock him moments earlier. Principal Williams, who had been principal during David's senior year and was now nearing retirement, made his way through the crowd. "David," he said warmly, extending his hand, "I heard you were here. It's wonderful to see you." "Mr. Williams," David said, and his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You look great." "I've been following your career," the principal said. "The whole district is incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. That scholarship program you funded last year has already changed dozens of lives." David had quietly donated money to create a scholarship program for students from low-income families at Riverside High. He'd done it anonymously, not wanting any recognition. "That scholarship program," Mrs. Patterson said to the crowd, "provides full college tuition for 20 students every year. Students who might not otherwise have the opportunity for higher education." The impact of this information rippled through the crowd. David wasn't just successful, he was giving back to the very school where he'd been tormented. "Why?" Brad asked suddenly. "Why would you give money to this place after how some people treated you?" David looked at him for a long moment. "Because it wasn't the place that hurt me, Brad. It was the people. And for every person who made my life difficult, there were teachers like Mrs. Patterson who believed in me and helped me succeed." He gestured around the room. "There are good kids in this school right now who are facing the same challenges I faced. They deserve better than I got. They deserve to be judged by their character and their potential, not by their family's income." The gymnasium had gone quiet again. People were processing not just David's wealth, but his response to the way he'd been treated. Instead of bitterness or revenge, he'd chosen generosity and forgiveness. "I should probably get going," David said finally. "It's been educational." "Wait," Ashley called out desperately. Can't we start over? Maybe grab coffee sometime, catch up properly." David looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Ashley, an hour ago you were making jokes about my humble beginnings and suggesting I was a failure because I drive a rental car. Now that you know I'm wealthy, you want to be friends. What does that tell you about yourself?" She had no answer for that. David began moving toward the exit, but the crowd followed him. Former classmates who had barely acknowledged him earlier were now trying to get his attention. take selfies, exchange contact information. "David," Kevin called out. "Hey, maybe we could set up a business meeting sometime. I'm in real estate and I bet you need—" "I'm good. Thanks," David said without stopping. At the exit, he paused and turned back to the crowd one final time. "I want to leave you all with one thought," he said. 20 years from now, some of you might be at another reunion, talking to someone else you think is beneath you, someone driving an old car, wearing modest clothes, working what you consider an ordinary job. Remember tonight. Remember that you never know who you're really talking to, or what they might accomplish if given the chance. He looked directly at the group of former bullies, who stood together looking shell-shocked and ashamed. But more importantly, David continued, remember that it shouldn't matter. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. That's not about being politically correct or nice. It's about being human. With that, he walked out into the night, leaving behind a gymnasium full of people who would be talking about this reunion for the rest of their lives. Outside, David sat in his rental car for a moment, breathing deeply. His phone was already buzzing with social media notifications. People from the reunion were posting about meeting him, sharing articles about his success, trying to associate themselves with his story. But David felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but sadness. Sadness that some people never learned to see beyond their own narrow perspectives. Sadness that wealth was what it took to earn basic respect from certain people. And yet, as he drove away from Riverside High for what might be the last time, David also felt something else. Peace. He'd wondered for 20 years what would happen if he faced his tormentors again. Now he knew. He'd found out exactly who they were, and more importantly, he'd shown them exactly who he'd become. Not just successful, but decent. Not just wealthy, but wise. Not just powerful, but kind. As he drove toward the airport, David smiled. Tomorrow he'd be back to changing the world one student at a time, and that felt like the best revenge of all.